They call me Grandpa Wit, which has always struck me as a name too small for what people assume I am, and too large for what I actually own. I am 64 years old. I drive a 2006 Ford Ranger with a bench seat that has molded itself to the shape of my back over 18 years of ownership, a truck bed I have never once used for anything but hauling mulch, and a check engine light that has been on so long I have started to think of it as a decoration rather than a warning. I live in the same brick ranch house I bought the year my daughter was born, on Featherstone Lane, where the mailboxes lean at different angles, and nobody has ever once asked what anybody else does for a living, because nobody there has ever needed to. My name is Walter Combs, and for 36 years I have let people believe exactly what they wanted to believe about me, because it has never once cost me anything to let them. Here is what my barber doesn't know. Here is what the Tuesday men's group at Grace Lutheran doesn't know. Sitting around folding tables, drinking coffee that tastes like it was brewed sometime during the previous administration. Here is what the kid at the auto parts store doesn't know when he looks at my Ranger and asks, gently, like he's breaking bad news to a man who might not take it well, whether I've thought about a trade-in. I own Ashford Meridian, an investment and holding company with positions in manufacturing, commercial property, and a controlling stake in 11 regional companies spread across 6 states, structured so carefully across shell layers and blind trusts that my own accountant needed 4 years working for me before he understood the full shape of it. Ashford Meridian is worth just north of $2 billion. I drive a truck with a broken cup holder and a passenger door that only opens from the outside if you lift it slightly first, and I would not trade either one of those inconveniences for anything. Now let me tell you about my daughter, because she is the only part of this story that ever actually mattered to me. Delaney Combs Whitfield is 31 years old, and she has her late mother's stubbornness and my patience, which her mother always said was a dangerous combination, and her mother was right about most things, so I trust she was right about that too. Delaney runs a small nonprofit that places therapy dogs in children's hospitals, a job that pays her almost nothing and gives her, I think, everything. When she told me at 22 that she wasn't interested in any of the business stuff, I told her that was the finest decision she would ever make, and I meant it with my whole chest. 4 years ago, she brought home Grant Whitfield. I want to be fair to Grant. I have tried, across 4 years, to be fair to Grant, the way you try to be fair to whether you don't particularly care for patiently, and without much hope that it will improve. Grant is 36, tall, the kind of handsome that requires a great deal of upkeep and wants you to notice the upkeep. He wears a watch that costs more than my truck and has never once in 4 years asked me a single question about my life that wasn't a setup for a question about his own. Within 20 minutes of meeting me, he had mentioned his fraternity, his handicap, and a ski trip to Aspen that he described in the specific tone people use when they want you to picture them there without them. 14 months after the wedding, Grant Whitfield was named Chief Operating Officer of Prescott Valve and Fitting. Now here is where you need to lean in close, because this is the part that makes the rest of it make sense. Prescott Valve and Fitting is one of Ashford Meridian's portfolio companies. Industrial fittings and valve systems, 380 employees, unglamorous, profitable, and solid, the way a good foundation is solid. Nobody admires it, but everything stands on it. Grant applied through a search firm, went through 4 rounds of interviews, and was told, honestly, that the board had been impressed by his numbers at his previous company. What nobody told him, because nobody at Prescott knew, is that I sit on the ultimate holding board above that entire company, and I had personally reviewed every finalist's file before the board ever voted. I did not tip the scale for Grant. I want to be clear about that, because it matters later. I let him win the job honestly, on the numbers, because I believed, the way I have always tried to believe about people, that maybe I had been wrong about him. He texted Delaney that night, "Just got the COO job. Tell your dad his son-in-law's officially somebody now." She read it to me over the phone, laughing. "Congratulations, son," I said. "You earned that." Then I hung up and went out to check on my tomatoes, because that's what a Tuesday evening actually looks like when you're not performing anything for anybody. I want to tell you honestly that I hoped for better than what came next, because I did. It started the way these things always start, With small currency nobody else in the room would notice spending. At a company holiday party, a junior engineer asked who I was, and before I could answer, Grant said, "Oh, that's just Delaney's dad, retired handyman, sweet old guy," and steered the young man away by the elbow, like I was a coat rack somebody had left in the wrong spot. I smiled. I found the shrimp cocktail. I filed it away, the way I file most things away, quietly, in a drawer that never seems to run out of room. But the moment that actually changed, something happened on a Wednesday in March, 4 months before this story really begins. I had come by Prescott to walk the floor with one of the plant managers, unannounced, the way I do it once or twice a year, dressed the way I always am, flannel, worn boots, a company visitor badge that says nothing about who signs the checks. I was passing the break room near the loading dock when I heard Grant's voice through the half-open door, talking to another executive. That particular easy laugh he does when he thinks nobody important is listening. Delaney's dad? God, no, he's harmless. I think the guy used to fix furnaces or something. Real salt of the earth type, drives this ancient truck, grows tomatoes, whole 9 yards. A pause, and I could hear him shrug it into his voice. Delaney feels like she has to check on him a lot, which, I mean, somebody's gotta, right? Not exactly a power couple's dream in-law situation, but hey, what can you do? I straightened my visitor badge and walked out the side exit before either of them saw me. A man who used to fix furnaces. I let that phrase live in me for 4 months, turning it over the way you turn a stone over in your pocket, not because it hurts you, but because you like knowing exactly what shape it is. If you've made it this far with me, do me one small favor before we go on. Hit subscribe. Doesn't cost you a thing, and it means more than you'd guess to an old man telling stories on the internet. The dinner invitation came from Grant's parents, Roland and Bitsy Whitfield, out at their place in Cutler Hills, the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights look apologetic for existing. Delaney called me, bright and hopeful the way she gets. "Dad, they finally want to have you over properly. 4 years, can you believe it?" I think Bitsy's nervous, actually. She keeps asking what you like to eat. "Tell her anything's fine, sweetheart," I said. I've never once been a difficult guest. Then Grant called, which was, on its own, unusual enough to be interesting. Friendly, easy, working up to something. "Hey, Walt. Quick heads up on Saturday. Mom and Dad are pretty particular about, presentation. Nothing crazy, just, maybe, skip the flannel, something with a collar, at least." I told him I appreciated the thought. He told me he just wanted everybody comfortable. I told him I understood completely, and I did better than he knew. I hung up, stood in front of my closet for a long moment, moved past the one good suit I keep for funerals and the occasional board meeting, nobody photographs, and pulled out my cleanest flannel and my second best boots. I laid them out on the bed. Then I walked to the driveway, put my hand flat on the hood of the Ranger, and said, out loud, to an empty carport, "We've got a dinner party, old girl. Dress code's exactly what we're wearing." Because here is the thing nobody in that house was going to understand until it was much too late for them to do anything about it. I wasn't underdressing because I didn't own better. I was underdressing because I wanted, one final time, to watch a room decide who I was before they had any information worth deciding on. Saturday came in slow and gray, the way important days sometimes do, wearing no warning on its face at all. I woke at 5:15, same as every day since I stopped needing an alarm clock somewhere around 1994, made coffee black, sat at my kitchen table, and watched the light come up over the fence line. I am, by nature, an unhurried man. It has served me better than any single decision I ever made in a boardroom. I dressed slow, clean jeans, the good flannel, boots, polished the night before, out of nothing but personal pride, not for anybody's benefit, and drove out to Cutler Hills with the windows down because the Rangers' air conditioning has held strong opinions about working since roughly the Clinton administration. The Whitfield house sat behind a stone gate, with hedges cut so precisely they looked less like landscaping and more like a warning. A young man near the front steps, not quite valet, not quite anything, watched the Ranger roll up the driveway with an expression I have seen on 100 faces across 4 decades, the fast, silent math of a man trying to figure out if he's about to be embarrassed or if I am. "Evening, sir. I can park that for you," he said, recovering fast. "Much obliged, son," I said, handing him the keys. "She pulls right if you're not ready for it." Roland Whitfield opened the door before I could knock. Tall, silver, the kind of handshake that ends exactly on schedule and not a second later. "Walter, so good of you to finally join us," he said, in the tone of a man welcoming a delivery he'd been expecting. Bitsy appeared behind him in earrings that cost more than my truck's engine, took both my hands in hers, and said, "Aren't you just the sweetest thing?" in the exact voice people use for old dogs and small children who can't yet follow a real conversation. Sweet, there it is. Never impressive, never sharp, sweet. Delaney crossed the room and wrapped both arms around me the way she has since she was 3 years old, and I held on maybe 1 second longer than usual, because some things a father knows before his head does. Grant appeared behind her, looked at my flannel for exactly half a second longer than politeness allowed, recovered his smile fast, and clapped me on the shoulder like we were old fraternity brothers. "Glad you made it, Walt. Dad's opening something special." Everything that night was something special. The wine, the china, the imported cheese nobody could pronounce. Everything except me, and I let that be true, because I have learned, across 64 years, that the most dangerous thing a man can do in a room that has already decided he's harmless is correct them 1 minute too early. Dinner went the way I expected it to go. Roland talked about the markets, and a recent trip to Portugal, and how proud he was of what Grant's built at Prescott, which made me nearly choke on my water. Considering Grant had inherited 380 employees and a functioning supply chain I'd spent 11 years assembling before he ever walked through the door. Bitsy turned to Delaney at one point, patted her hand, and said, "You must feel so secure, having a husband who provides so well. Not every girl gets that kind of security." The table went quiet for exactly one breath. Delaney smiled the way she smiles when she's protecting somebody else's feelings instead of her own. I picked up my water glass and said nothing, because the folder hadn't come out yet, and I already knew, with the particular certainty of a man who has waited out worse rooms than this one, that once it did, the whole evening would turn over like a card. It came with dessert. Roland reached under his chair and produced a leather folder, smoothed it once with his palm the way men do when they've rehearsed the gesture in a mirror, and slid it across the table toward me. "Walter, there's something we wanted to discuss, as a family," he said, voice dropping into that measured register men like Roland reserve for moments they believe will define them. Grant's had an idea percolating for some time now, a venture of his own, completely independent of Prescott. We think it's extraordinary. What we're proposing, he tapped the folder twice, is that Delaney's trust, the one from her mother's estate, be used as collateral to help get things moving. Fully legal, drawn up properly, above board every step of the way. We just need your blessing, as her father. I looked at that folder for a long moment before I touched it. Delaney's hands were still in her lap, and they were not still the way hands are still when a person is calm. "I want to be honest with you here, because I think you deserve the honesty even if nobody in that dining room got it that night. I had never once, in 31 years, told anyone the exact size of the trust my late wife Carol had left for Delaney. Not because it was a secret worth keeping from Delaney. She'd known the number since she turned 25, same as any responsible parent would tell their child, but Roland and Bitsy didn't know it. They had simply looked at a modest brick house and an old truck and a man who grew his own tomatoes and decided, the way people like that always decide, that a trust from Mama's people must mean something worth chasing, dressed it up in their own imagination until the number in their heads had 6 figures more than reality, and never once thought to ask a single direct question before drawing up paperwork to attach themselves to it. I opened the folder. I read every page, slow, deliberate, while the candles burned down, and nobody at that table found the nerve to speak. Then I closed it, set it gently on the tablecloth, and said, "I appreciate the thought that went into this. I'll review it carefully." Roland exhaled, like a man surfacing from a long dive. Grant's shoulders dropped half an inch. Bitsy reached for her wine like the hard part was behind her. They thought they'd won something. I finished my water, thanked Bitsy for a lovely evening, shook Roland's hand a full second longer than the first time, and drove home in the dark with the windows down, calm, in a way that would have frightened anyone who knew exactly what that calm usually means. I said nothing for 11 days, tended the tomatoes, went to Tuesday men's group, got the truck's oil changed at the place on Route 9 where they still call me the furnace guy because of a joke Grant clearly hadn't invented on his own. On day 4, Grant texted, "Hey Walt, any update on the paperwork? Big things brewing over here." I waited 3 hours and replied, "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." He sent back a thumbs up. Then I made one phone call, not to Grant, not to Roland, but to the 3 senior board members of Prescott Valve and Fitting, men who had worked with me for over a decade and understood exactly what it meant when I called directly instead of through channels. "Pull the full compliance audit on Grant Whitfield," I said. "Every vendor contract he's touched, every expense line, full scope, starting now." Then I hung up and went back out to stake my tomato plants, because here is what Grant did not know, what Roland and Bitsy sipping their imported wine in Cutler Hills did not know. I had personally written the executive conduct and non-compete clause in every officer's contract at Prescott 8 years before Grant Whitfield ever shook my hand for the first time. A clause built, patiently, for exactly this kind of man, long before I knew his name. The audit took 9 days to fully document. What it found didn't surprise me, though I sat with the report a long while anyway, because certainty is a thing worth earning properly rather than rushing toward. For the past 6 months, Grant had been quietly steering 2 of Prescott's largest vendor contracts toward a private consulting shell registered under his brother-in-law's name. Skimming a finder's fee off supply agreements, he had full authority to approve without a second signature. A clean, careful little scheme, built on the confident assumption that nobody above him was paying any real attention. He had forgotten, the way men like Grant always eventually forget, that you cannot quietly build something crooked inside a house that belongs, however invisibly, to somebody patient enough to be watching the whole time. On a Thursday morning, I put on the one good suit, the one from the closet nobody photographs, and drove the Ranger to Prescott. I parked in the reserved spot out front, with the small brass plate that reads simply W. Combs, a plate Grant had walked past 3 times a week for over a year without once asking whose name it was. I walked into the boardroom, sat at the head of the table, board members to my left, legal counsel to my right, and waited 4 minutes for Grant Whitfield to walk in, believing he was arriving for a routine check-in. He scanned the room, the lawyers, the folder in front of me, and then his eyes landed on me at the head of his own table, in a suit he had never once seen me wear. I watched the understanding move across his face slowly, floor by floor, the search firm, the contract clause, the brass plate he'd never questioned, 4 years of sweet old Walt, arriving all at once in a boardroom on a Thursday morning. I let the silence sit a full 10 seconds before I spoke. "Sit down, Grant," I said. He sat. "I'm not angry. I want you to understand that first, because anger is for men who didn't see something coming, and I have seen this coming for a long time." I opened the folder. Prescott Valve and Fitting is owned by Ashford Meridian. Ashford Meridian is owned by me, has been for 22 years. The office you sit in, the salary you've built an entire personality around, exists because I built the company underneath you brick by brick, decision by decision, while you were still figuring out which fraternity to pledge. And for 6 months, you used the authority I extended you in good faith to quietly steal from it. Every trace of the confidence he'd walked in with drained straight out of his face. He looked, for the first time in 4 years, very young. "Here's what happens now," I said. "You resign today, quietly, and repay every dollar the audit identified, and this stays between these walls. Or we proceed legally, and every page of this becomes public record, along with your name attached to it." He looked at the board, looked at the lawyers, looked back at me, and something moved behind his eyes that I hadn't expected, and, I'll admit, it caught me somewhere soft. Not defiance, not performance, but something closer to real shame, the kind that only shows up once a man finally sees himself clearly and doesn't much care for the view. "I'll resign," he said, quiet, like the words cost him something to spend. "Good," I said, and stood, and buttoned my jacket. At the door, I turned back. "One more thing. Your father's proposal, Using Delaney's trust as collateral, I had my attorneys move it this morning into an account requiring her signature alone, irrevocably. Tell your parents I said thank you for dinner. The lamb was excellent. I drove home with the windows down, the Ranger groaning through its usual complaints, the late sun catching the crack in the windshield I'd never bothered to fix. I sat in the driveway a long moment before going in, thinking about 18 years of being a man nobody looked at twice, and knowing exactly who I was the entire time anyway. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She came over within the hour and found me at the kitchen table, 2 mugs of coffee already poured, going cold. She sat across from me and studied my face the long, careful way she's studied it since she was small enough to sit in my lap, reading it like a page she already half knew by heart. I told her everything, the company, the audit, the clause I'd written 8 years before Grant existed in either of our lives, the boardroom, the trust I'd moved that morning. When I finished, she was quiet a long time. Then she looked up and asked the only question that had ever really mattered. Dad, why didn't you ever just tell me? I looked down at my coffee, out at the dark yard, then back at her, her mother's steadiness in her eyes, the same stubborn tilt to her chin she'd had since she was 3, and refusing to nap. Because I wanted you falling in love with your own life, I said, not with what your father happened to own. I never wanted you looking at me and seeing a company, Delaney. I wanted you to see your dad, she cried, and I held her hand across that old table and let her. Because some evenings the only job left for a father is to be steady, while somebody he loves finally lets go of something. I thought, briefly, about Roland sitting very still in that house in Cutler Hills, about Bitsy setting down her wine glass, about Grant finding some way to explain to his parents how the harmless furnace guy in the flannel shirt turned out to be the one man at that table they should never, not for a single second, have underestimated. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go, because the only thing that ever really mattered to me was sitting right across that table, hands wrapped around a cooling mug, eyes red, smiling anyway. My daughter, the finest thing I ever built, and the only thing I ever built that I never once needed to hide. Some men don't need to announce what they are. They just are, quietly, for as long as it takes, and the people who mistake that quiet for nothing, they always, eventually, find out otherwise. If this one got you, do an old man a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe if you want more stories like it. I'll see you in the next one.